Hi, this is Leo Volont. This is part 2 of my 7-part series, Democracy is a Bad Thing. This is chapter, The Age of Enlightenment. In this episode, we discuss the transformative elements in the 18th century's Age of Enlightenment, the necessary prelude to the Industrial Revolution. When we were thinking of why Europe left the protective shelter of authoritarianism and allowed itself to be swept up by the chaos of democracy, well, Europe had become a far different place in the span between 1650 and 1800. Let's look at some of the forces that vectored into play. To begin with, there had been an interesting contemporary of Hobbes, Rene Descartes. You know, the I think therefore I am guy. But that was just chitter-chatter compared to his real earth-shaking contribution to world civilization. He was the one who developed the X and Y graph that we draw coordinate number lines on to understand algebra and trigonometry. Before Descartes and the Cartesian graph, no mathematicians anywhere in the world could see what they were doing. It was like working blind. Descartes literally invented the mathematical drawing board. It was an innovation on the same scale as perhaps the invention of the wheel or of fire. So of course, within a generation, we had both Newton and Leibniz inventing calculus within 5 minutes of each other. With Newton using a dashing, elegant notation, while Leibniz would do what Germans always do: take what is already difficult and make it even harder. Once mathematicians could see graphically what they were doing, all sorts of mathematical truths became obviously axiomatic. Mathematicians for the next 2 centuries would be pulling down all the low-hanging fruit that Descartes had revealed to the naked eye. And because math had become so much easier to comprehend and follow, more people began to study it. It was the beginning of the move made by all European universities from classical education towards more emphasis on scientific studies. The new emphasis on math and science transformed the social and economic dynamics of Europe. The vast increase in mathematical talent available to commerce, manufacturing, architecture, and shipbuilding was the impetus for the Industrial Revolution. Wealth and thus power started coming into new hands. Previously, it was thought that all wealth was derived from the land. Look up the physiocratic school of economic theory. Yeah, that is sort of how feudalism and medieval economics worked. They did not have any conception of capitalist growth economics. They didn't grow wealth. No, they lived off of it. Every year the rents were exactly the same, but that was enough for them. For 800 years in a row, inflation across Western Europe was under 1% per century. Wealth and power was synonymous with being a big landlord, and that was to be an aristocrat. We had the genteel ethos where it was uncouth to ever speak of money and business. They had servants to worry about that kind of stuff. The landed aristocracy was comfortable being comfortable, where the capitalists remind me of ravenous wolves restlessly pacing back and forth. You know, the lean and hungry look of treachery. So, who was happier? The refined, contented, and genteel aristocrats, or the scheming, money-grubbing, predatory capitalists? We can't allow ourselves to believe the capitalist self-serving narrative about having been progress. Today it seems to be an article of faith with the leftists that however bad capitalism is, it was still a step above feudalism. But really? The capitalists tell us what to think and we just give them the usual, yeah, boss. But just think about it. We are presently advocating for a sustainable, no-growth economy where people will be content with having enough. Am I the only one who recognizes feudalism in that? We just need to update feudalism a bit, that's all. Check out my video, Revolution from the Top. It's a series. Another factor in the transformation of the European zeitgeist was the vast improvement in ship sail, rigging, keels, and rudders. These simple but profound innovations allowed larger cargo-carrying vessels to sail into the wind by tacking. It meant that if any wind was blowing at all, despite its direction, sailing boats could go anywhere. Historians are mind-boggled that from the ancient Egyptians through the Phoenicians, through the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then the Venetians, that none of those long-headed idiots ever thought to try a few things and see what would work. We're just talking about some incremental changes that should have seemed obvious. Also, at some time or another, a tremendously significant innovation in ship design developed, and it is so now taken for granted that, well, it's unsearchable. But I do remember it from my reading somewhere, and that is the enclosed hull. You know, putting a deck on top of the boat's hollow cargo carrying area so that water can't get in. Yeah, for ages ships could be sunk by even just a hard rain or one wave slopping over the top. So the widespread practice of enclosing the hull with an upper deck and incorporating even the crudest bilge pumps made for a new class of unsinkable ocean-going vessels. That meant that ships could wander out from the relative safety of the ordinarily much smoother Mediterranean Sea into the wider and rougher but far more rewarding oceans. Once the first models of these unsinkable anywhere, anytime boats were built, the world would never be the same again. Screw the Industrial Revolution, we had a boat building revolution. But then there was the math revolution too. We really have a hard time with the European history of this period in settling the cart and the horse problem of what came first and what caused what. We just know for certain there was a very busy century and a half between Hobbes and Hamilton. Anyway, what this revolution in boat building did was allowed for the oceanic sailing that led to both the discovery of the New World and transferred the center of sea trade from the Mediterranean to the European Atlantic ports. The Dutch lowlands with their port cities became a major economic and commercial power for about 5 minutes. But the new money people from business, trade, brewing, and manufacturing from all over Europe and Britain saw that the Dutch businessmen were able to exert leverage on their governments. That put new ideas for conspiracy and intrigue into all their heads. One major factor that gave the business classes new leverage was gunpowder, if you can follow a chain of reasoning. You see, before gunpowder, the order of society was preserved by the maintenance of a heavy armored cavalry manned and paid for by the landed and aristocracy under the coordination of the king. You know, feudalism. But the aristocracy with their own castles and so much force of arms in their own possession could be trouble too. But after the 14th century with gunpowder, the kings were increasingly able to neutralize the power of their unruly barons by hiring common musketeers on the cheap to blow holes through the knight's personal armor or use cannon to blow down their castle walls. But the expense for all those campaigns was still coming entirely out of the king's own pocket. Yeah, compared to equipping armored knights and huge specially fed battle horses, ordinary men and guns were cheap. But it was an entirely new expense, and there simply wasn't a traditional budget to cover for it. And ordinarily, the aristocracy would help with the king's expenses, paying for their charters. But they would resent having to pay for their own suppression, right? Oh, and then there were the fleets with ever larger battleships, which were useless for cargo and only good for war. And so they were a huge deadweight expense most of the time. Yes, things were getting expensive for the kings, while the aristocracy wasn't eager to help them out. So the kings had to go begging to the businessmen, and this would lead to their downfall. Now the business and financial classes did not understand that they could be their own worst enemies if they themselves became the engines for war, competition, and conflict. Their rise would be a unique event in history, at least as far as they knew, and they neither understood their own strengths nor their own weaknesses. So they didn't see the general overall danger of overthrowing strong authoritarian government and replacing it with their shopkeepers and bankers brand of anarchy. Whoever thinks that factions of yourself can be your own worst enemy. The businessmen could have had it all. That is, in exchange for giving the kings a percentage of their revenues, the kings could have given them monopoly charters across all trades and industries. They could have been set up as a hereditary aristocracy of banking, trade, and finance, backed and supported by the king's force of arms, that is, men with guns, so they wouldn't have to rely for their protection on the landed aristocracy, whom they knew despised them. Instead, they decided to make enemies of both the kings and the barons, going it alone, choosing to ride the tiger, as they say in Asia, supposing that in the face of any crisis, even of their own making, that they themselves would be the ones to be able to land on their feet and be the ones still left standing after all the dust settles. Yeah, as a class they did well enough, but look at the families. Here today and gone tomorrow. The capitalist class is a pack of cannibals. They eat each other. The aristocracy came from the stocks of ignorant and culturalist invading barbarians. But the generations would refine and acculturate them. But the capitalists are replaced with a fresh crop of coarse and ignorant barbarians with each generation. Now, we must also remember that this was the post-Reformation period, and the Protestants had substituted a predatory, self-serving doctrine for the social morality that had come out of the monasteries of the Dark Ages and had brought Europe up to its peak of high medieval development during the 11th and 12th centuries. See my 11-part series, Jesus the Jew versus Christianity, where I discuss this and a bunch of other stuff. The Reformation drastically shifted European moral assumptions, and the tone of capitalism would be deeply nihilistic, amoral, and barbarian. In the next part, we will discuss democracy. We'll get into democracy. Take care.